Alright, so this next section we're going to talk about bonds and the acid-base balance, and we'll end up by talking about what electrolytes are. So there's two major types of bonds that you're going to find in chemistry. So we have the ionic bond and the covalent bond. An ionic bond involves ions. And if you remember from the previous section, ions are charged atoms. So let's draw out sodium for a minute. So we have sodium. And if we go to the periodic table here, we're going to find sodium has an atomic number of 11. Now if you remember, the atomic number is equal to the number of protons, but it also equals the number of electrons, because the protons with the positive charge cancel out the electrons with the negative charge. So in an uncharged atom of sodium, we have 11 electrons. We're going to draw the first ring, which has 2 electrons, and then the second and subsequent rings can have 8 each. So we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now what we've drawn is 10 electrons total, so we got to bring another ring in here, and then we have one lone electron floating around on the outside here. In order for atoms to be happy, they want to have a full outer shell. So sodium's not happy having this one floating around out here. This is able to form bonds with other atoms. So it's the electrons that are in the outermost shell that are able to form bonds. There's an easier way than drawing out all of these rings in here. You can figure out how many valence electrons there are, or how many electrons there are in that outer shell, just by looking at the periodic table trends. Everybody in this row right here would have 1 valence electron. Everybody in this row here would have 2 valence electrons. Everyone in this row here would have 3 valence electrons. This row would have 4 valence electrons. This row would have 5 valence electrons. This row would have 6. This row would have 7. And this row would have 8. Because this row has 8, all of their atoms are happy, so they're not readily going to form bonds with any other atoms. These are known as the noble gases, and they are highly unreactive. They're not going to form many bonds. So there's a difference between the charge and the valence electrons. The valence electrons is simply talking about how many electrons fill up that outer shell. Now the charge is talking about how many electrons can be gained or lost by that atom. And if you gain them, you're going to become more negative because electrons have a negative charge. If you lose them, you're going to become more positive because electrons have the negative charge. You're giving up negativity, you're going to become more positive. So going back to sodium here, an easier way to depict sodium is by just drawing the electrons in the outer shell. So since sodium is in this row, we only have 1 electron in its outer shell. So we have Na, and we'll draw this. Now that electron wants to leave, but it can't just float into outer space. It has to be accepted into something else. So we look at the table here to see, are there any that could accept electrons? Well, for the most part, we have on this side of the table are our metals. So all of these are considered metals, with the exception of hydrogen. Hydrogen's a gas, it's not going to form a metal, but it kind of behaves as a metal, so we put it over on this side. All of these over here are the nonmetals. So these are our gases. When we go further into the definition of what an ionic bond is a bond between ions. It's a bond that forms between the positively charged metals, known as the cations, and the negatively charged nonmetals, known as the anions. This group in here in the middle Those are metalloids. They have characteristics of both metals and nonmetals. And they do form bonds and such, but we're not going to focus on these guys in here. For the purpose of this class, since this is an anatomy class and not a chemistry class, we're just going to focus on the metals and nonmetals. So looking at all these nonmetals, any of these could form a bond with sodium, because any of these that have a negative charge could accept electrons. I'm sure you're all familiar with table salt, and table salt is NaCl, sodium chloride. So let's look at chlorine. Chlorine, if we go back to the periodic table, has 7 valence electrons. And because it can form a -1 charge, that means that it has the capability of accepting 1 electron. So chlorine has 7 valence electrons, and it wants to accept 1 valence electron. So if this valence electron were to leave sodium and jump to chlorine, then sodium would become more positive by 1, and chlorine would turn into chloride, and it would become negative by 1 because it accepted one of those negative charges, -1. This right here is an ionic bond. An ionic bond is held together simply because opposite charges are attracted to each other. Sodium wants to hang out near chloride because sodium's electron jumped to chloride. So these are going to stay near each other. They're oppositely charged, so they attract to each other, and this is what an ionic bond is. If we were to look at a solution of salt water, the water molecules would dissolve the sodium and the chloride ions, and even though sodium and chloride ions would be near each other, the water kind of disrupts them. So they're able to float freely in solution a little bit. So sodium chloride, this is an ionic bond. So an ionic bond, again, some characteristics. It's between a metal, which is typically the cation, or the positively charged ion, and a nonmetal, which is typically the anion. The positive charge likes the negative charge, so this bond is held together by opposite charges attracting. One gives up electrons, so the metal loses electrons. And electrons I abbreviate E negative, while the nonmetal will gain electrons. And that's kind of the basis of an ionic bond. So why are these ionic bonds important when we're talking about anatomy and physiology? Well, knowing about ionic bonds are going to help you determine how these ions are going to travel through the neuron, through the neuronal membrane, in order to generate a nerve impulse or an action potential down a neuron. So being familiar with the fact that these aren't actually physically connected to each other. Sodium gave up an electron, chloride ion accepted it, and they're just kind of hanging out near each other because opposites attract. That's important. Sodium gave its electron to chloride, but if another atom were to come along, let's say a fluorine atom were to come along, sodium could have given its electron to fluorine to make it fluoride. So this isn't a very strong bond. It's just an association of oppositely charged ions, and they're hanging out near each other because one has given up an electron and the other one has accepted the electron. So magnesium is a metal, chlorine is a nonmetal, so this would be another example of an ionic bond. If we draw out what this one would look like, we have magnesium. If we go to our periodic table here, magnesium is in this row here. So magnesium has 2 valence electrons. Now we have Cl2. So that means that there's 2 chlorine. So we have to draw chlorine on our paper twice. Now if you recall, chlorine is in this row, so it has 7 valence electrons. Each one of those chlorine ions, or chlorine atoms, sorry, can accept 1 electron to become the chloride ion. So we draw the 7 on each. Now this one can jump to this one can jump to here, so when we form our ionic bond, we get Mg plus 2 because it lost 2 negative charges, and then each one of these chloride ions gained that electron, so each one is going to become negative by 1. And these are going to hang out near each other. So that in solution they can dissolve and kind of rotate around each other, but they're going to stay near each other. They're not physically connected to each other, but they like each other because they're oppositely charged. Potassium bromide, if you want to try that one, we can definitely go through that in class, but potassium bromide, that's another type of ionic bond. Potassium is going to lose an electron, bromine is going to gain that electron. When we talk about covalent bonds, I'm going to add another slide here. So in a covalent bond typically forms between two nonmetals. In a covalent bond, these are the strongest type of bonds. And it's due to a sharing of electrons. So if we take 2 nonmetals, let's do CH4, methane gas. Carbon is right here. It has 4 valence electrons. So we'll draw carbon with 4 valence electrons. Now we have 4 hydrogen. Hydrogen is in this row, so hydrogen has 1 valence electron. And now even though it's on the metals side of things, I did mention that hydrogen is kind of a weird exception. It's actually a gas. We consider it a non-metal. So hydrogen bonding with anything would not form an ionic bond. Typically it would be the covalent bond. So we're going to draw 4 hydrogen, and each one of those hydrogen has 1 valence electron. Now if this were ionic, the hydrogens would end up giving up their electron and getting a positive charge, while the carbon would gain all those electrons and get a -4 charge. But that's not the case in covalent bonds. In covalent bonds, they actually share electrons. So instead of one giving up and the other taking, they're going to form a solid bond. And this is a very strong bond that's going to hold these together pretty permanently, unless you have some major catabolic reaction happen where these are separated. But for the most part, once these strong covalent bonds are formed, they're pretty difficult to break apart. So this is what CH4 would look like. You have the central carbon, and then you have 4 hydrogens floating around the outsides. If we do one more example, CH3OH. So we're going to draw our carbon, and carbon has 4 valence electrons. And then we have 3 hydrogens. Now we're going to connect these together to form the solid bonds. And now we have an oxygen. Now, oxygen has 6 valence electrons. If we go look at oxygen, here it is on the periodic table with 6 valence electrons. So if we draw the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, now we're going to connect the hydrogen. Well, there's this one that is able to be shared with hydrogen, so we can connect these together. So this is what CH3OH would look like. If you want to know the name of this is methanol, so we have one methyl group and then we have the alcohol group, so this is basic type of alcohol. But anyways, this is what that would look like, CH3OH. Hopefully you were able to follow along with how these bonds were formed. For this class, again, since this isn't a chemistry class, you will never have to draw these out anywhere outside of like a homework assignment or something that we do in class. But on exams, quizzes, you just need to know the basic definitions of what ionic bonds are and what covalent bonds are. Now that you've seen the structure, for some people that's helpful because now they can see, oh, that's where the electrons came from and this is how they form bonds. If it wasn't helpful to you and you feel completely overwhelmed right now, we'll just get through the lab activity or homework assignment together in class, and then you'll never have to worry about how these bonds are forming, at least not for this class. So the information's there. Hopefully it made sense to you guys, but you definitely need to know the difference between an ionic bond and a covalent bond. So ionic, that's where you have opposite charges attract. Covalent bonds, that's where you have a strong bond formed due to a sharing of electrons. The way that I tell this to my chemistry students is think about bonds like dating or marriages. In an ionic bond, opposite charges are attracted to each other. So maybe it's opposite personalities, maybe it's opposite sexes. Something about them is different and they're attracted to that difference. So opposites attract, and they're pretty weak. I mean, if you're dating someone, you can ditch them and find somebody new. And that's how ionic bonds work. Even though the one has given up an electron and the one has taken an electron, you can easily give that electron back and then that one can give its electron to someone else. So it's kind of like a dating-like relationship. In a covalent bond, it's like a marriage. There's a sharing of electrons, and that's pretty committed. Now, there's some outside forces that can change that. They require energy, and it takes a lot of work to break that apart. But covalent bonds is a sharing of electrons, and that's kind of like a marriage. You share a whole bunch of stuff in a marriage. It's very strong, and it's difficult to break. So water. We need to go into a little bit of the importance of water. If we look at what water looks like, water is H2O. So we have 2 hydrogens and an oxygen. So we'll draw the oxygen first. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So because these are paired up here, we don't bond those. Those are already set. But we need to form bonds with this single one and this single one. So if we draw our hydrogen here and our hydrogen here, now we have what water looks like. And those are the covalent bonds. So that's what water looks like. So it has a strong electronegative pull toward the oxygen. So this kind of has an overall negative charge toward the oxygen, while the hydrogens have an overall positive charge. So because of this polarity, because of this difference in what atoms are on what side of the molecule, water is kind of the universal solvent. It can dissolve almost everything that's not like fat-based. But water is a pretty good solvent. Water also aids in the excretion of waste through urination, defecation, and sweat. So in this class, we'll touch on this a bit when we get to the urinary system. But water helps draw wastes into it, and then you can dispose of that water. So you can sweat out the wastes that were dissolved into the water. You can urinate out the wastes that were dissolved in the water, or you can defecate out the wastes that were dissolved in the water. So water has a really good capacity to draw things into it. It regulates your body's temperature. If you think about sweating, that's a major way that it will regulate your body temperature. Cushions and protects organs and tissues. So you have stuff like cerebrospinal fluid. That's a majority of it is made up of water. So it's going to cushion and protect the brain and spinal cord. You've got all sorts of fluids, like the pericardial fluid that surrounds the heart. You've got joint fluid that's going to help lubricate the joints, which is the next point. It keeps your joints lubricated. It helps your body parts move. It helps transport nutrients and waste throughout your body. In your bloodstream, you have the plasma, or the liquid portion of the blood, and then you have the formed elements, which are the blood cells, your red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and so forth. So in that liquid part, that's the majority of that is water. And if you don't have a lot of water in your bloodstream, you're not going to be able to transport nutrients and waste through the body. It aids in the breakdown or hydrolysis of macromolecules in your cells. So we'll explore this a little bit in this class, but whenever you want to try to break apart a large molecule, like let's say you have starch that you just ate in the diet. In order to break the bonds, to break them down into little tiny pieces that your body can actually use for energy, you need water. So water helps break those bonds. Just real quickly, if we look at a molecule of starch, so starch is a bunch of glucoses that are linked together. And glucose forms a hexagon structure. There's an oxygen in the ring, and then there's a CH3OH group sticking up. But in general, we're going to just draw some oxygens here, or some hexagons. So that's what starch kind of looks like. In order to break these apart so that we can use each individual one, we actually insert water, H2O. The H goes on one side, and then an OH goes on the other side. And water efficiently breaks these bonds of these large molecules. Now, if one of these is broken off, then we can use it for energy production, or we can use it to build our own structural components inside of our cells. So we need water in order to break the bonds of any of our nutrients that we need to use in the body. It keeps body tissues moist, and it aids in the electrolyte and acid-base balance in the body. The other type of bond is the hydrogen bond. So the hydrogen bond, of course, involves hydrogen, but it's hydrogen that's bonded to usually an oxygen or a nitrogen by these forces. So the hydrogen with the overall positive kind of charge around it interacts with this oxygen on this other molecule of water. This allows for something like surface tension to form. If you've ever seen those little insects walk on the surface of water, water molecules are held together due to these hydrogen bonds. What we see over here is DNA. So we have the backbone of DNA, and we'll go into this structure a lot further in this class. But then we have the bases that line up in the middle. Thymine bases or pairs with adenine, guanine pairs with cytosine. And what holds DNA together, the double-stranded DNA, is hydrogen bonds. So 2 hydrogen bonds can form between T and A, while 3 hydrogen bonds can form between G and C. So again, I'm not going to have you draw out hydrogen bonds, but you do need to know the definition. A hydrogen bond is a weak bond that forms between hydrogen and an electronegative atom, such as oxygen or nitrogen. Acids, bases, buffers, and pH. An acid. So when we talk about what an acid and base is, we have this solution of water. And inside of the solution, we have dissolved. So if we have a solution, we have dissolved hydrogen ions and dissolved hydroxide ions. Now if we put these together, we have HOH, basically have H2O, that's water. But in solution, once they're separated from each other, we have these positively charged hydrogen ions and these negatively charged hydroxide groups. If you have an excess of positively charged hydrogens, that's what's known as an acid. So an acid has a high concentration of hydrogen ions. When you talk about pH and how you calculate pH, pH is the negative log of the concentration of hydrogen ions. So when we're calculating pH, we're figuring out, well, how many hydrogen ions are present. The more hydrogen ions you have, the lower the pH. So an acid has a low pH. And that pH is going to be, if you look at this pH scale, we have 7 is neutral. Anything less than 7 is an acid. A base has a low concentration of hydrogen ions and a high concentration of hydroxide ions. Anything above 7 is considered a base. And what a buffer is? A buffer is a substance that attempts to prevent a change in pH. So it will donate and accepts hydrogen ions to prevent a change in pH. Your body wants to maintain a relatively stable pH level. Every cell inside of your body wants to have a certain type of pH. So we have built-in buffer systems inside the body that prevents an overall change in pH. And if our pH gets off balance, then we could slip into a coma and die. We can't have super acidic or super alkaline conditions in the body. Then our enzymes don't function properly, and we'll learn a little bit more about that in the upcoming segments of this lecture. So we have these built-in buffers, and one of the primary built-in buffers is an amino acid. So amino acids are building blocks of proteins, and we will be getting into them in a little bit more detail in this lecture. But an amino acid has this carbon and then a hydrogen group, but then it has this NH2 amine group, and it has this COOH carboxyl group, and then it has this R group, and that makes each amino acid unique. But every amino acid has this basic structure. The amine group could accept a hydrogen. So this kind of acts as the base side of things. If you see here, nitrogen only has 2 hydrogens, so you have the nitrogen that's bonded to the carbon, then you have the nitrogen bonded to one hydrogen and to another hydrogen. It could technically bond to another hydrogen in order to accept that hydrogen. Now the carboxyl group acts as the acid side. This hydrogen can be donated easily, so could donate an hydrogen. So why does this matter? Well, your entire body is made up of proteins. And if each amino acid has the potential to serve as a mini buffer system, then that will greatly increase the likelihood that we won't change our pH inside of our cells and our enzymes can continue to function properly. This side can accept a hydrogen, this side can donate a hydrogen. So if we're ever in a situation where there's too many hydrogens, this side will accept it for us. And if we're ever in a situation where there's not enough hydrogens, then this side can donate it for us. So the last topic that I'm going to talk about for this section is electrolytes. Electrolytes have a charge. And they're going to help regulate the fluid balance in the body. We all hear about electrolytes in Gatorade and so forth, but electrolytes are charged particles, and they're going to help restore the ionic balance so that we can continue to have proper muscle contractions and proper hydration in the body. Electrolytes conduct electricity in solution because they are charged. Non-electrolytes are not charged. So these will not form an electrical charge in solution. So if we look at this table of electrolytes, you can see that anything that starts with an H, these are actually types of acids. Acids can serve as electrolytes. Anything that ends with OH is actually a base. And bases can serve as electrolytes. This is another acid. This NH3 is an amine base. This is actually ammonia. And then here we go, there's a couple salts here. So salts can serve as electrolytes. Non-electrolytes consists of all nonmetals that are not acids and bases. So if we look at this, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen are all nonmetals. These types of sugars are considered non-electrolytes. Water is considered a non-electrolyte. So these are not charged, and they are going to be mostly made up of nonmetals.